Don Filiberto Ruiz had been sitting on the same bench on the porch of his cottage every evening for 40 years, and in all that time he had never once seen anyone come up the path from the main road after dark carrying 2 children and a single lantern. So, when he saw it, the small bouncing light, the silhouette of a woman with a child on her back and another one holding her hand, he stood up before he had decided to stand up, which was the kind of thing that happened to a man when his body remembered something his mind was still catching up to. Welcome. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. His wife Refugio appeared in the doorway behind him, drawn by the same instinct, drying her hands on her apron the way she always did when she was about to do something that needed doing. They had been married 51 years. They did not need to consult each other. Don Filiberto walked to the gate, and Doa Refugio went inside to put the pot back on the stove. And by the time the woman with the lantern reached the gate, her hands had already stopped shaking, not because she was no longer afraid, but because something in the way the old man opened the gate without asking a single question told her that whatever happened next, she was not going to be turned away. Her name was Natividad Flores. Everyone called her Nati. She was 31 years old, and she had 2 children, Toms, who was 7 and had walked the last 4 kilometers without complaint, and Bella, who was 3 and had fallen asleep on her mother's back somewhere around the 2nd kilometer and had not noticed any of the rest. In her coat pocket, she had a rosary her mother had given her the day she married, which she had been working through with her thumb for the last hour of the walk without being entirely conscious of doing it. On her back, along with Bella, she had a bundle that contained 3 changes of clothes, a small tin of sugar, and a patched blanket, the cobija remendada that had been on her grandmother's bed, and before that, on her great-grandmother's, a thing so mended and remended over so many decades that the original color of it was a matter of family debate, and so warm that Nati had never in her life slept cold when she had it with her. "Please," she said to the old man at the gate, "just for the night. I have nowhere else to take them." Don Filiberto looked at Toms, who looked back at him with the steady eyes of a 7-year-old who has decided that showing fear is not useful. Then he looked at Billa asleep on her mother's back, one small fist curled against Nati's neck. Then he stood aside and opened the gate all the way and said, "Come in." Doa Refugio has the stove on. The story of how Natividad Flores ended up on a mountain path in Durango after dark with 2 children and a lantern was not a complicated one, though it had taken a long time to arrive at its worst point, the way floods do, slowly, then all at once. She had been married to Aurelio Flores for 8 years. They had lived in a rented house in the town of El Salto, where Aurelio worked at the sawmill and Nati kept a small kitchen garden and took in mending. The marriage had not been a bad one in the early years. It had become a bad one gradually, as Aurelio's brother Cirillo began to spend more time in their house, and more time in Aurelio's ear, and as Cirillo's opinions about what Aurelio deserved from life, more than he was getting, more than a wife and 2 children and a rented house, took root and grew into a plan that neither of them bothered to inform Nati of until the plan was already in motion. The plan was this. The 2 brothers had found a buyer for a small parcel of land that had been left to Aurelio and Nati jointly by Aurelio's late father. The land was a plot with a cottage in the Sierra outside Guanachev, a place nobody in the family had visited in years, that everyone agreed was too remote and too overgrown to be worth anything. The buyer, a man named Barrera who worked with the municipal land office, had offered a price that Cirillo considered generous, and that would, he explained to Aurelio, set them up for something better in the north. Aurelio had signed. Cirillo had signed as witness. The notary had filed the papers. Nobody had told Nati. She found out on a Tuesday morning when a woman from the land office came to the door to confirm the transfer and used the phrase "your husband and his brother" in a way that made it clear she assumed Nati already knew. Nati thanked her calmly, closed the door, and stood in the kitchen for a full minute before she was able to move again. When she asked Aurelio that evening, he did not deny it. He said the decision had already been made. He said the money was going to set them up properly. He said she would understand when she saw how things turned out. "You sold land that belonged to both of us," Nati said, without raising her voice, "without telling me." Aurelio said it was complicated. Cirillo, who was sitting at the table, said that women tended to be sentimental about property and that it was better this way. Nati looked at Cirillo for a moment. Then she looked at Aurelio. Then she went into the room where the children were sleeping and sat down on the edge of Tom's bed and worked the rosary through her fingers until her hands were steady again. That was 3 weeks before she appeared at Don Filiberto's gate. In those 3 weeks, she had consulted a woman in El Salto who knew about land law and discovered that the sale had been filed improperly, that her signature, as co-owner, was required by law and had not been obtained, and that the transaction was therefore legally contestable. She had also discovered that Barrera, the buyer, had been notified of this problem and had responded not by correcting it but by accelerating his timeline, filing a secondary claim through a different channel that would, if it went through, make contesting the original sale significantly more difficult. She had written 3 letters. She had received no replies. She had gone to the land office and been told to wait. She had gone back and been told to wait again. On the 21st day, she packed what she could carry, took her children, and began walking toward the only place she could think of that Barrera's paperwork did not yet reach. The cottage in the Sierra that was supposedly being sold out from under her, that she had never seen, that she had a legal right to be in, and that she intended to occupy before anyone could tell her otherwise. It took her 2 days to reach the mountain path. It took her 4 hours on the path to reach the light of Don Filiberto's lantern. Doa Refugio fed them. This was not a small thing. She fed them the way women feed people who have walked too far. Not a polite portion, but a real one, with seconds offered before the first bowl was empty, and bread torn in pieces and set in the middle of the table, and warm milk with piloncillo for the children, because children who have been carried up mountain roads in the dark need something sweet before they sleep. Tom's ate with the focused attention of a boy who had decided to be brave about being hungry and was now releasing that decision one spoonful at a time. Bella, awake now and installed on Doa Refugio's lap as if she had always lived there, ate her bread in small, careful bites and looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone conducting a thorough assessment. "She's very serious," Doa Refugio said, looking down at the child. "She takes after her great-grandmother," Nati said. "She never trusted anything until she'd looked at it from all sides." Don Filiberto had said very little since they sat down. He was a man who had learned that the first hour someone spends in your house is their hour, not yours. That what was needed was food and warmth, and the particular silence that says you are not going to be asked to explain yourself before you are ready. It was Tom's who offered the explanation, because Tom's was 7 and had been holding it in for 2 days. "Our father sold our grandmother's house," he said, with the flat precision of someone who has processed a thing enough to be able to state it plainly. "But my mother says it wasn't his to sell." Don Filiberto looked at the boy. "Is that right?" "Yes, she went to the office 3 times. They didn't listen." "Offices are like that sometimes," Don Filiberto said. "My mother says when the office doesn't listen, you go to the place itself." "Your mother is correct," Toms looked at him with the evaluating attention of a child who has been disappointed by adults before and is not yet prepared to revise that position. Then, he went back to his bowl. The cobija remendada came out that night, when Doa Refugio was settling the children on the cot in the back room. Billa was already asleep again before her head was down, and Toms lasted approximately 4 minutes before following, and Natty unrolled it from the bundle and spread it over them both. Doa Refugio looked at it for a moment, the patchwork of different fabrics, the careful, mended seams, the weight of it. "Old," she said. "My great-grandmother's," Natty said. "Before that, her mother's. I don't know how old. The old ones are the warmest," Doa Refugio said, with the authority of a woman who has known many blankets. She was right. The children did not stir until morning. The cottage that Barrera had agreed to buy was a 20-minute walk from Don Filiberto's gate, up a narrower path through the pine scrub, and around the back of a rocky outcrop, in a small clearing that caught the afternoon sun from the southwest. Don Filiberto had known it for 40 years. He had known Aurelio Flores's father, had bought timber from him once, had attended the man's funeral. He knew the cottage, knew the clearing, knew the old peach tree at the edge of the property, whose fruit was the best in the Sierra, and whose existence had been a matter of local knowledge since before anyone currently living could remember. He did not say any of this to Natty that first night. He said it the next morning, over coffee, after Toms had gone out to look at the goats and Billa had reattached herself to Doa Refugio with the efficiency of a child who recognizes a grandmother when she sees one. "You know the place," Natty said. "It was not a question. I knew your father-in-law. He was a good man. He wouldn't have wanted what happened." Natty looked at her coffee. "No, he wouldn't. The cottage needs work," Don Filiberto said. "It's been empty 4 years. I know how to work. There's a peach tree on the eastern side. Still gives fruit. Has for as long as I can remember." Something shifted in Natty's face. Not softness exactly, something more like recognition, as if a fact she had not known she needed had just arrived. "My father-in-law used to send peaches," she said, "every summer. A whole basket, packed in straw. I never knew where they came from." Don Filiberto nodded slowly. "I helped him pick them the last 2 seasons before he died. We'd split the harvest. He'd pack his half and send it down to the family." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sound of Toms explaining something serious to a goat. "He picked those for us," Natty said. Quietly, as though the sentence needed to be small. "Yes," said Don Filiberto. "I think he did." What Natty was not yet aware of was that beneath the old peach tree, at the base of the eastern-facing side where the roots had built up a low ridge of exposed ground over decades, there was something the old man had noticed years ago and never had occasion to examine. And that had been on his mind since the moment he heard the story of what Barrera and the Flores brothers had done, something that was going to change the nature of this dispute entirely. That evening, esa noche, Don Filiberto walked up to the clearing alone with a lantern and a short-handled spade, and came back 2 hours later without saying anything to anyone except Doa Refugio, who listened in the kitchen doorway and then nodded once and went back inside. The work of reclaiming the cottage began the next day. Don Filiberto lent tools. Doa Refugio sent food up the path in a basket every morning, beans and tortillas, and sometimes a jar of atole for the children, and came herself 2 afternoons a week to help clean what the years of emptiness had left behind. Toms proved to be a serious and capable worker for a 7-year-old, with an instinct for which tasks were within his scope and which were not, and the self-regulation to respect that boundary without being told. Billa was less strategically useful, but brought considerable morale to the enterprise, narrating events from the doorstep with a running commentary that seemed to improve everyone's spirits regardless of whether it was comprehensible. The cottage was sounder than it looked. The roof needed patching in 2 places. The floor was solid. The walls were thick and dry. There was a clay oven in the kitchen that required cleaning and a new coat of plaster but was otherwise intact. There was a well that gave clean water. And there was, on the eastern side, under the spreading arms of the peach tree, the cobija remendada pinned to a branch each morning to air while Nettie worked, which became the thing her eye always found when she looked up from what she was doing. A fixed point in the clearing, familiar and warm, that made the place feel, incrementally, like somewhere. A week into the work, Don Filiberto came up the path one morning, carrying not the usual tool bag, but a small cloth-wrapped bundle, which he set on the table inside the cottage and unwrapped without ceremony. Inside was a tin box, dented and rusted, and inside the tin box, still wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job for considerably longer than anyone had asked it to, were 3 things: a paper folded many times, a small drawstring pouch, and a brief note in handwriting that Natty recognized immediately, because she had seen it on the address of every basket of peaches that had ever arrived at her door. Her father-in-law's handwriting. The note said, "For whoever is here when this is needed. Under the tree, where the roots go deep, things keep better than you'd think." She opened the drawstring pouch. Inside were coins, old ones, silver, more than she had expected, the kind that had not been minted in decades, but whose value had not diminished on that account. And inside the folded paper was a document, a second deed to the cottage and the clearing, drawn up by a different notary than the one Barrera had used, registered in a different office, predating the sale by 11 years, and listing the property's proper lines and measurements in the methodical language of someone who had wanted there to be no question. The cottage had been registered twice. The older registration was the valid one, and the older registration named the property as belonging jointly to Aurelio Flores and any spouse of legal standing, a clause that Barrera's notary had either not found or had chosen not to mention, and that rendered the entire transaction not merely irregular, but void. Natty set the document on the table. Her hands were very still. Toms, who had been watching from the doorway, said, "Is that good?" "Yes," Natty said. "That's very good." "Did great-grandfather leave it?" Natty looked at the note again. "Yes, for whoever was here when it was needed." She looked at her son. He knew someone would need it. Toms considered this with the gravity appropriate to the situation. "He sounds like he was smart." "He was," said Don Filiberto, from the other side of the table. "He was also stubborn and occasionally difficult, but mostly smart." The man from the land office arrived on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after Natty had moved into the cottage. Not the same office, but the regional one in the capital of the municipality, which had jurisdiction over the first office and which had received, through a local lawyer Don Filiberto knew from 40 years of Sierra dealings, the second deed, the original registration, and a formal written objection to the sale on behalf of Natividad Flores, co-owner of legal standing. Barrera arrived with him, and behind Barrera, looking smaller than he did in his own kitchen, came Cirilo Flores. They came up the path on a morning when the autumn light was clean and the peach tree had dropped the last of its leaves and stood bare and utterly certain of itself against the sky. Natty was in the doorway. Don Filiberto and Doa Refugio were in the clearing. Toms was beside his mother, which was where he had decided he would be, and Billa was on Doa Refugio's hip, which was where she had decided she would be. Barrera spoke first. He spoke about timelines and registered filings and the administrative difficulties of reversing a completed transaction. He spoke at some length and with the careful fluency of a man who has learned that if you speak long enough about administrative complexity, people begin to feel that the problem is too large for them. Nathy let him finish. Then she stepped forward and placed the second deed on the stone wall of the well where everyone could see it, with the original registration date facing up. This property was registered in my name as co-owner 11 years before your transaction, she said, with the quiet clarity of someone who has been to the land office 3 times and is not going back a 4th time empty-handed. The sale required my signature. I did not give it. That makes the transaction void. This is the document that says so, and this is the lawyer who has already filed it with the regional office. She did not shout. She did not shake. The Cobija remendada was on its branch in the morning light behind her, and the peach tree stood above the place where the second deed had waited 11 years for exactly this moment, and the clearing was so quiet that the only sound for a moment was the wind off the Sierra and Bella asking Doa Refugio something in a low, serious voice. Barrera looked at the document. He looked at Cirillo. Cirillo looked at the ground. It was Cirillo who spoke then, not to Nathy, but in her direction, with the deflated look of a man whose plan has come apart more completely than he intended. It didn't have to be like this, he said. Nathy looked at him steadily. No, she said. It didn't. There was nothing more to say. Barrera turned and went back down the path. Cirillo followed him. Neither of them looked back. Don Filiberto watched them go. Doa Refugio shifted Bella on her hip. Toms, standing beside his mother, watched the 2 men disappear around the rocky outcrop with the expression of someone filing the outcome away for future reference. Then he looked up at Nathy and said, "Now what?" Nathy put her hand on his shoulder. She looked at the cottage, the patched roof, the clean walls, the oven that had been lit every day for a week and still smelled faintly of fresh plaster and pine smoke and something warmer underneath. She looked at the peach tree, bare and patient, at the Cobija remendada moving in the morning air. Now, she said, we finish the floor. By the time the first snow dusted the peaks of the Sierra above Guanacev, and the people of that part of Durango began the quiet preparations for winter that people in mountain country have always made. The cottage in the clearing was a different place from the one Natty Flores had walked into 6 weeks before. The roof was sound. The clay oven threw heat through the whole kitchen and halfway into the front room on cold evenings, and the smell of what Natty cooked in it, beans and bread, and on Sundays a pot of mole that Doa Refugio had taught her to make with the dried chiles from her own pantry, carried down the path to Don Filiberto's cottage in the evenings. And on more than one occasion the old couple had found their feet carrying them up the path at dinner time without any formal invitation being required. The peach tree was bare, but Don Filiberto had told Natty what to expect in spring, that when the frost broke it would bloom before anything else in the clearing, white flowers before the leaves came, and that the fruit it gave was unlike any other peach he had eaten in 50 years of living in these mountains. She had written it down in the margin of the worn cookbook her mother had left her, in the way her mother had always noted things worth remembering. The Cobija remendada was on the bed where it belonged, over Toms and Billa, who had taken to sharing it without dispute, and under which they slept with the profound unconsciousness of children who have stopped being afraid of the night. On a Sunday in December, when Don Filiberto and Doa Refugio had come up for the midday meal, and a neighbor from further up the path had appeared with 2 of his grandchildren and been brought inside and fed, and a woman from the clearing's far side had come to return a borrowed pot and stayed, and Toms had organized the smaller children into a project involving pine cones whose rules were unclear but seemed to be going well, and Doa Refugio was at the table telling Bella a story that Bella was receiving with her customary serious attention. The cottage was full of the sound and warmth of people who have found, against the available evidence, that there is room. Nati stood at the kitchen doorway and looked at it. Don Filiberto came to stand beside her with his coffee cup. "Your father-in-law would have liked this," he said. "I think he planned it," Nati said. "The deed, the coins, the note. He put it there for a reason. He knew his sons," Don Filiberto said simply. Nati looked at the old man, at the steadiness of him, the 50 years of showing up to whatever the mountain asked, the way he had opened a gate in the dark for a woman he had never seen, because his body remembered what was right before his mind had finished deciding. She thought about the rosary in her coat pocket, worn smooth, where her thumb had found it on the path in the dark. She thought about doors. Sometimes God puts the exact right people at the exact right gate, at the exact moment when you need a door to open and you have run out of the strength to knock on another one. Not strangers, never quite strangers. People who knew the people who loved you, who held the place open without knowing they were holding it, who light a lantern on the right evening because that is simply what they do. Did an unexpected door ever open when all the others had closed? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and share this with someone who needs to remember that we are never quite as alone as the worst nights make us feel. Until the next story, a hug, heart to heart. And inside the warm cottage in the clearing, the Sunday afternoon went on, the coffee, the voices, the children and their pine cones, the cobija remendada waiting for night. Ordinary and luminous, the way life is when it finally reaches the place it was always meant to be.